Chapter 33. Mikaru's excited warning was a little premature. Arasaka's army were not actually charging up the valley as he implied, but the first elements had been sighted just a day away. As Horace had surmised, Arasaka had repeated his earlier tactic and sent a fast-travelling advance party ahead of his main force. The Kikori scouts had counted 100 armed senshi, carrying minimal baggage and moving towards the valley at a steady jog. "How did they know we're here?" Horace asked. Holt shrugged. "They may not know your exact location. They're probably just tracking you. After all, a party as large as this one would leave plenty of signs for a halfway decent tracker." "So, what is our best move now, Hoto-san?" Shigeru asked. They were gathered in his cabin to discuss this latest eventuality. Shigeru, observing how Horace deferred to the bearded ranger, and knowing Reito's limitations as a combat commander, had questioned Horace at length about Holt's background and experience. Horace had left him in no doubt that they were lucky to have such an experienced tactician at their disposal, and Shigeru had appointed the ranger in command of the defense of Rankoshi. "The palisade is repaired," Holt said, "and the trap at the western end is just about complete. Another half-day should see that done. I suggest we sit tight behind the palisade, wait for them to attack, and then bring down our avalanche on top of them." "Will they attack?" Shigeru asked. "Perhaps they will wait for Arasaka's main force to catch up." Holt shook his head. "I doubt it," he said. "It makes no sense to come racing across country after us, only to sit down and wait when they eventually catch up. Arasaka knows that the snow is coming." They all glanced at the open doorway. It was snowing outside. With each day, the flakes became bigger and heavier, and the snowfalls longer. Already the cover on the ground was 8 to 10 centimeters deep. "He'll want his men to hit us before the real storms come. After all, he knows you only have 30 or 40 warriors with you." "There are around 200 Kikori men as well," Will said, but Holt made a dismissive gesture. "From everything the Emperor and Reito-san have told us, Arasaka won't be expecting them to fight. That could give us a big advantage." "If they will fight," Horace said gloomily. He worried that when the time came, the Kikori might be affected by centuries of tradition and history. They had rarely rebelled against the senshi in the past, and when they did, the results had been catastrophic. He felt the chances were high that they would, at the last minute, be overwhelmed by their sense of assumed inferiority. Assisting the Emperor to escape and standing up against the highly trained senshi warriors of Arasaka's army were two entirely different matters. "They'll fight," Will said firmly, and Holt turned a questioning eye on him. "You seem sure of that. What have you and Selethan been up to? You've been spending a lot of time with the Kikori." Will and the Aridi leader exchanged a quick glance. Then Will shook his head. "Early days yet," he said. "Just an idea we're working on. We'll tell you when the time is right." "In any event," Holt said, dismissing the matter for the time being and returning to the point Horace had raised. "The Kikori will be fighting from behind a defensive position, not facing the senshi in open combat. That'll make a difference. All they'll have to do is keep shoving them back down off the wall." "As easy as that?" Horace said, grinning in spite of his earlier misgivings. But he thought Holt had a point. Fighting from behind a defensive position was less daunting than facing an enemy on an open battlefield. With any luck, not many of Arasaka's warriors would get close enough for individual combat. "When do you think they'll attack, Holt?" Selethan asked. "Our scouts say they should be here late tomorrow. I would assume they'll size up the situation, rest for the night, then hit us first thing the following morning." Selethan nodded agreement with the estimate, But Shigeru was a little surprised at the speed things were moving. "So soon," he said. "Won't they have preparations to make?" he asked vaguely. "They don't have any heavy weapons or siege equipment with them," Holt said. "After all, they had no real idea that we would find us in a ready-made fortress like this one. My guess is they'll spend the night getting a few scaling ladders ready, then try and rush us. After all, they have nothing to gain by waiting." The sky was overcast and heavy with clouds. In the east, through a gap between mountain peaks, the sun could be made out as a red, watery ball rising into the sky. A cold wind blew up the valley, bringing snowflakes with it. Above the soft keening of the wind, Holt could hear the rapid tread of feet, crunching on the rocky ground before them. "Here they come," he muttered, as Arasaka's advance party, moving in 3 uneven columns, rounded the last bend before the palisade. He turned to Will. "Don't waste arrows on the ones at the foot of the wall. Rocks and spears will do for them. Save your shots for any who make it to the top. They're the ones we need to stop before they get a real foothold." Will nodded. They were pacing the timber walkway on the inner side of the palisade. Shigeru's few Senshi warriors were in defensive positions. Beside them and behind them, the Kikori crouched, out of sight. Some had their heavy axes ready, but most were armed with spears or long poles they had cut to use as pikes. The tips were carved into points, which had been hardened in fires the night before. Every 5 meters, piles of large, jagged rocks stood ready for use against the attackers. "Stay down, Kikori," Holt said quietly as he passed the crouching timberworkers. They grinned nervously up at him, and he added, "We'll soon be giving Arasaka a very unwelcome surprise." They reached the decrepit western end of the palisade. Here 10 Senshi and the same number of Kikori were stationed on the planked walkway behind the badly patched, dilapidated wall. "They'll concentrate here once they've realized," Holt called. "Be ready to get off the wall as soon as you feel it's going." The mixed group of defenders nodded, their faces serious, their thoughts focused on the coming fight. Holt surveyed the new inner wall with satisfaction. It was lower, but much sturdier than the old palisade, altogether a much more defensible position. He glanced up to the piled rocks, earth, and timber balanced precariously above on the rock wall. The Kikori had contrived to cover the rocks with branches and bushes, even leaving one small sapling springing out from the mound so that it appeared more natural. Looking carefully, he could just make out the ropes trailing away from the deadfall. "Get ready!" It was Horace's voice. He was at the midpoint of the palisade. He had his shield on his left arm. The unfamiliar shape of a Nihon-Ja katana was in his right hand. Behind them, they heard and felt feet on the ladder that led up to the walkway from below. They both turned to see Shigeru, in lacquered leather armor, stepping onto the walkway, closely followed by Reito. "Your Highness, I'd really prefer it if you'd stay back from the fighting," Holt told him. He knew Shigeru was no expert with the sword. Capable, perhaps, but expert? Never. "Your preference is noted, Hoto-san," said Shigeru, making no move to retire back down the ladder. Holt met his gaze for a few seconds, then shrugged. "Well, I tried," he said. At a shouted order, the attacking force suddenly broke into a run. They had no particular formation. They spread out in a rough line as far as the narrow valley walls would allow. The line was 3 or 4 men deep. Holt made out 5 rudimentary scaling ladders, each one nothing more than a single thick sapling trunk, notched to accept cross pieces, which were then bound in place to act as rungs. At least another 10 men were carrying ropes and grapnels. The plan was obviously to assault the wall at 15 or 16 different points at once to overextend the 30-odd senshi who could be seen defending the palisade. The attackers had no idea that 100 Kikori were crouched below the wooden ramparts. The first 3 ladders crashed against the wall almost simultaneously at 3 different points, and Shigeru's men moved to bar the way to the men climbing them. Holt waited until each ladder had several men on it. "Kikori, now!" he yelled. The waiting timber workers rose to their feet with a wordless roar of defiance. Rocks showered over the ramparts, hurled down into the mass of senshi at the bases of the ladders. The first attacker to reach the top of a ladder cut at a Kikori, who ducked the whistling blade just in time. Mocha thrust with his sword, and the man screamed and plummeted off the ladder. Elsewhere, Horace blocked another attacker's sword with his shield. Before he could retaliate, however, a wild-eyed Kikori spearman shoved him aside and buried his spear in the senshi's shoulder. With a screech of pain, the man fell back onto his comrades, massed below. A third ladder was sent toppling as 4 Kikori pikemen thrust their long poles against it, shoving it sideways until it crashed over. The senshi closest to the top managed to spring onto the rampart. It was only a momentary respite. He barely regained his balance before a Kikori axe sheared through his armor. He toppled forward, crumpled over the rampart. Another defender shoved a spear handle under his shoulders and levered him back, sending him crashing back to the side he came from. Grapnels were rattling against the walls now as Arasaka's men tried to clamber up hand over hand. Holt heard Reito and Mocha, the 2 senior members of the Emperor's senshi, shouting instructions to the defenders, and he knew the gist of their words. "Let them get at least halfway up before you cut the ropes." They had determined this strategy the night before. A man falling from 3 or 4 meters stood a good chance of being injured, particularly if his comrades below were brandishing weapons. At the midpoint of the wall, Holt saw one of Shigeru's bodyguard engaged in swordplay with an attacker who had made it over the wall. The still forms of 2 Kikori were at the attacker's feet. As Holt watched, an arrow slammed into the defender's chest and sent him staggering back off the rampart. Before the attacking warrior could take advantage of his momentary respite, Selethan's tall form moved gracefully to the attack. His curved saber cut into the gap between the senshi's helmet and the neckpiece of his armor. Satisfied that the threat had been taken care of, Holt glanced around and saw another defender, a Kikori axeman this time, fall to the planks with an arrow in his chest. The ranger searched the valley below the wall. 5 senshi, armed with the long, asymmetrical recurve bows favoured by the Nihon-Ja, had stopped some 30 meters behind their comrades and were picking off the defenders. "Will!" he shouted. His apprentice had moved away to cut through a grapnel rope with his sax knife. Now he looked, saw Holt's outstretched arm pointing to the group of archers, and slipped the bow off his shoulder. "You from the left, me from the right," shouted Holt, and Will nodded. Once before, they had made the mistake of shooting at the same enemy in a battle. Now both longbows sang their dreadful song, and the senshi at either end of the line of archers staggered back, staring in horror at the arrows that had punched through their leather armor as if it weren't there. Before their comrades registered the fact that they were down, the rangers dropped the next 2 within a heartbeat of each other. The 5th man searched in vain for the source of these deadly return shots. He had an arrow nocked, ready to draw and shoot as soon as he saw his opponent. He never managed it. Will's 3rd arrow slammed into him. He dropped his bow, clutching at the terrible shaft, then fell and lay still. Now a captain among the attackers, realizing that the first blind, formless rush had failed, was taking stock of the situation. He saw the patched and sagging western section of the palisade and realized this was an opportunity. He gestured for 2 men to pick up a fallen ladder and follow him. Along the way, he gathered 3 more, equipped with grapnels and ropes. The hastily assembled assault party ran along the base of the wall, dodging rocks that showered down from above to the weakened section. As they went, the captain rallied more men until at least 30 senshi were following him. He gestured at the single-trunk ladder, then at the rotting beams of the wall. "Use it as a battering ram! Smash through the wall!" he yelled. 6 more men, suddenly seeing what he was about, joined the 2 senshi wielding the log. They charged at the wall and, with one of them counting tempo, slammed it again and again into the brittle timbers of the palisade. 2 of the old logs shattered and split, a third sagged away at the next strike of the ram. More rocks hailed down on them, but the defenders' aim was not as accurate as before. Panic, the captain thought. He screamed at the men with grapnels, pointing to the top of the palisade. "Don't try to climb it! Pull it down!" he ordered. The grapnels whirred around, then sailed upwards, each one trailing a tail of rope behind it. 1 clattered back, but 2 bit into the wood and held fast. Instantly, 8 or 9 men tailed onto the ropes and heaved and strained backwards. A 3-meter section of the wooden parapet gave way and came crashing down in a cloud of dust and splinters. The men heaving on the rope staggered and fell, but recovered quickly and cast again. The grapnel that had missed with the first cast was now solidly buried in the timber at the top of the wall. As the attackers further down the wall saw what was happening, more of them streamed to join the assault on the western section. The tree-trunk battering ram smashed into the wall again, tearing a rent between 2 of the upright timbers. More men joined in the assault, swinging the ram with even greater force. Rocks and spears showered down on them now, but the attackers were mad with battle rage, and they knew that the section of the wall was almost breached. They could see the defenders deserting the ruined wall, running in panic to escape before it came crashing down. Yelling their battle cries, they surged forward triumphantly as, under the combined force of the ram and 4 grapnel ropes, the wall finally gave way and a 4-meter breach appeared. They clambered up over the shattered timbers, swarming through the gap. The first men through stopped, bewildered, faced by a new, lower wall that enclosed them on 3 sides. But the press of their companions behind them forced them forward into the enclosed space. More and more of them poured in before they realized they were in a trap. Horrified, they saw a line of heads appear over the top of the new palisade, at least 50 of them. Then a storm of hurled rocks and spears broke over them, and this time the defenders seemed to have regained their former accuracy. "Go forward! Keep going forward!" The captain who had begun the assault was still alive. He brandished his sword now to lead the senshi to a new attack. There was no way they could get back through the crowded, crammed breach. Their only hope was to scale this new, lower wall in front of them. As they started forward, he heard a strange cracking, grinding noise from above. Looking up, he saw what appeared to be a section of the mountain wall suddenly tearing loose. A vast pile of rocks, earth, and timber tumbled end over end down the wall, bouncing, smashing, crushing anything and everything in its path. A log smashed the sword from his hand, and a jagged rock slammed into him, driving him to his knees. As earth and rock thundered around him, he toppled sideways, knowing the assault had failed. Then everything went dark. The stunned attackers, with almost a third of their number killed or injured in the trap devised by Holt and Selathan, slowly began to withdraw from the palisade, leaving their fallen comrades behind them. They straggled back down the valley in small groups to face the wrath of their commander. General Todoki, leader of the advance party and one of Arasaka's most ardent supporters, watched in disbelief as his defeated men shambled out of the valley, bruised, bleeding, and disheartened. He screamed at them, his rage making him lose all control and all sense of dignity. For the most part, they ignored him. He hadn't been there with them, and they'd left over 30 comrades behind them without any chance of decent burial. That night, winter took care of that for them. The snow began in earnest, and by morning there was nearly 2 meters piled up in the valley. The pure white carpet obliterated all sign of the previous day's carnage.